Welcome to everyone who are joining us today for the CSE Development in Action webinar. This is part of the 2023 webinar series. My name is Evangeline. I'm the Alumni Engagement Officer with the CSE alumni team. It's really nice to see you all join the webinar today. Today's webinar is on understanding how carbon-financed projects contribute towards sustainable development goals. This topic is very apt given that we have the upcoming COP28 event happening in a few days, and our webinar speaker will be talking about COP28 and how this topic is relevant in regards to COP28. So today's webinar will be presented by Commonwealth Alumnus Lilian Kagume. Lilian is the head of carbon asset development at Climate Impact Partners. She will talk more about her work, her expertise as a carbon asset developer. She will talk about her work at Climate Impact Partners in this webinar. But before we go ahead, a little more about Lilian. Lilian has over 6 years experience in designing carbon projects. She uses her background in environmental management to measure, analyze, report, and verify the outcomes delivered by these projects. She's also an expert in monitoring progress against the UN Sustainable Development Goals and can assess SDG outcomes of multi-sectoral projects and policy interventions. All of this using different internationally recognized tools and methodologies. As I said, she will talk about her skills and expertise throughout this webinar. I'm pleased to let you know that Lilian is a 2015 Commonwealth Distance Learning Scholar from Kenya. She has completed her MSc in Environmental Management from the Open University. So without further ado, I would now like to invite Lilian to begin her presentation. Once again, if you have any questions for Lilian or on her skills on the webinar topic, please do send them via the chat box. Over to you, Lilian.
Thank you, Eva, for the introduction. So yeah, as you mentioned, I'm Lilian, a carbon asset developer with Climate Impact Partners. For today's presentation, I'll talk briefly about my scholarship journey and how it has contributed towards my career as a carbon asset developer and what we do at Climate Impact Partners. And then we'll have a brief overview on introduction to carbon financing and how the process for carbon asset development, and specifically also look at how carbon financed projects contribute to sustainable development goals, and also how we monitor that as part of the work we do. And also, of course, talk a few about the challenges and opportunities that, carbon financed projects face, and, wind up with a few pointers on our outlook towards COP28, which is starting this week. So my scholarship journey was an interesting one. It started in 2015 when I was awarded the Commonwealth Scholarship to pursue a Masters of Science degree with the Open University with the environmental management. We were very privileged to be the first cohort in Kenya because that degree is specified for developing countries, and in Kenya we happened to be the first group. We were a group of 9 people. So it has been an interesting one because when I started, I was just, very fresh from campus, still thinking about the career journey I wanted to take. But, with the scholarship, it was able to shape up my direction. And this was on climate change. So I was very passionate about that. And by the time I finished my degree in 2019, when we graduated, I had already now started working with Climate Impact Partners. By then, I was a junior carbon asset developer. But with the skills and knowledge gained plus the experience from those years working as a junior, I was able to actually be promoted as a senior carbon asset developer. So I'm very proud of being a Commonwealth scholar, and also seeing the impact that I'm contributing individually and also at a company level towards achieving development in our country and also Africa at large. So who is Climate Impact Partners? So we are a specialist in carbon asset development. So we basically provide solutions for climate action. We are a global company headquartered in the UK, but I'm based in Kenya. Our purpose is to develop highest quality climate solutions. And, our ultimate goal is to contribute towards keeping global warming at below 1.5 degrees, because we understand that, with the UNFCCC, UNFCCC, this is the recommendation that all states and governments are working at, so that, we don't go beyond the dangerous climate change levels. Our goal is to reduce 1 billion tons of CO2, and this we'll achieve by developing high quality carbon financed projects from which we create carbon credits, which I'll talk about, and also energy attribute certificates, which is generated through renewable energy projects. And why we do this is to support organizations that are looking at offsetting their emissions, those that they can't reduce within their host boundaries, so that we put a price on carbon to incentivize them to meet their climate goals. Our projects, we have a global process of projects across Africa, Asia, Europe, and these are multi-sectoral, so they range from clean cooking, clean water projects to renewables. We also have sustainable infrastructure projects, so projects within renewable energy, waste management, transport, also nature-based solutions. So we support and develop projects in the afforestation and reforestation industries, REDD+, grasslands, and also improved forest management, and blue carbon, so the likes of mangrove and so forth. So what we do is, in a simple language, is we develop projects for carbon financing. We support them through the development process, and technically we also support project developers in doing the actual development. And we also do the trading, so buying and selling of the carbon credits generated from these projects. And what is my role? So individually, my role is I support in designing of projects from inception. So advising project developers what they need to do in order to develop a high quality carbon project. We also do a lot of due diligence, because we want to make sure that, the investment decisions we make, because, some of these projects require very high capital to support them through implementation. So you need to do a proper risk assessment to make sure you are putting your money in the right place. We do now the technical work, so developing documents. So carbon process is a data business. It requires a lot of calculations, a lot of monitoring, and a lot of documents go with this process. So that's part of my day-to-day work. We also do capacity building for project partners, because we want to make sure that they're able to implement, monitor, and also report on the projects accurately and in a credible manner. So a lot of training is actually required to make sure the project partners have the right capacity. Also maintaining the overall quality control of CAD process. This is very critical in the carbon market, because it's not just about making reports. It has to be credible, very transparent. So there's a lot of quality control that goes into this process. The projects are audited by third-party auditors, and we have to support in organizing and actually accompanying the third-party auditors to monitor and verify the projects. the liaison with the certification standards. So different projects are verified by different certification standards. So we also support in that process to make sure the project is registered up to the ultimate issuance of the project. And of course, we are in a changing market where there's a lot of scrutiny ongoing in the market. The standards keep changing. The host country legislations and other emerging issues also affect the carbon process. And we have to keep track of this and of course, make sure the projects and the project partners are actually aligned to this requirement. So let me talk briefly about how carbon market started. So this started in 1994 when the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, popularly known as UNFCCC, came into place. And this was basically an agreement between states to stabilize the greenhouse gas emissions at a safe level. And this was followed by the enactment of or adoption of the Kyoto Protocol in 1997. And this basically marked it as the first legally binding agreement amongst state parties to implement the UNFCCC ultimate objective to prevent dangerous climate change. So I mentioned these, we are currently looking at keeping it below 1.5 degrees Celsius. And so after this in 2005, of course, now the Kyoto Protocol came into force and incorporated 3 mechanisms, which basically set the platform for carbon trading. So this was under joint implementation. There was the clean development mechanism. So this has what has been in use since 2005 for what we call the compliance market. And now we have the emission trading that allows for the trading of carbon credits generated by projects. So what is carbon finance? In very simple language, carbon credits, one carbon credit is equivalent to 1 ton of CO2 or carbon emission that either is being avoided or removed from the atmosphere. So when we talk of avoidance, we have projects that, are basically looking at avoiding any emissions from being emitted to the atmosphere, either through efficiency improvement, like for example, if we are doing an improved cook stoves where in the baseline you are avoiding use of a highly emitting technology, like for example, what is very popular in Africa, the 3-stone technologies. And then we have the removals, maybe when we refer to projects like forestry, mangrove that directly absorb carbon from the atmosphere. So when these carbon credits basically provide a way for companies to compensate for emissions by financing projects that reduce or absorb the carbon emissions. And the rationale behind this is, we have nations in the developed world, like Asia, Africa, and Europe, where, they are very highly industrialized, meaning they release a lot of CO2 or carbon in the atmosphere. And for them to actually be allowed to continue emitting, they have to commit or look for options to offset their emissions. And this is basically by looking at projects they can finance in developing countries so that we can offset those emissions. So basically, in a simple language, that is how emissions that is what carbon finance is all. So this carbon finance comes in to support the developing countries to develop their countries by allowing the developed countries to continue developing. So how is carbon finance utilized? So once now this carbon finance comes in, it goes to project developers, and this goes into support enhancing access to efficient technologies through subsidizing cost or offering loan facilities like either microfinances or what we call the revolving funds. So this allows them to give these units either for free or at a very affordable cost to end users. It also supports the warranty and after-sale services. It also supports operations and implementation of programs. You will realize maybe when I discuss in the next slide the effort and the cost that goes into just developing a very simple carbon project. It's very time intensive and very it's very high cost. It's very costly. So a lot of effort actually is required, and this is made possible by carbon financing. End user training and awareness creation, because you don't just sell or give away units or products to end users. You have to train them how to use them and also how to maintain them. And this actually is something that is supported through carbon financing. And also to mention that a lot of stakeholder consultations is required, and this is an ongoing process up to the end of life of the carbon project. Research and development, this is also very critical and is supported by carbon finance, because you have to keep evolving with the market demands and also specifically to meet customer needs. So carbon finance is also utilized by project developers, and also to come up with very innovative platforms like data management systems and so forth. The monitoring and evaluation is an ongoing process that must be done annually. So this again, part of carbon finance goes into that, and supporting community development initiatives. So like, for example, if we are doing a nature-based project, like a forestry project, you are actually required to commit to sharing some of the revenue to support community. So doing projects like schools, roads, health facilities, or offering school scholarship for children. This is some ways in which projects utilize carbon financing. So what projects are eligible for carbon financing? So there's a wide range of projects that can be qualified for carbon financing as long as they meet the specific requirements. So the type of projects that qualify are actually stipulated in the methodologies. So when we take these projects for what we call the registration process, you have to first check whether they are eligible for financing. So for example, if for a cook stove project, they will do a tests to confirm the efficiency, to make sure that it is safe for use, to make sure that the emissions like the PM 2.5 and also the carbon levels are manageable and not posing any harm to the end users. So there's quite a well laid out framework that each project must assess against to first initially just determine whether it can be eligible for carbon financing. So the type of projects that are known and eligible for carbon financing are distributed technologies like improved cook stoves, induction cook stoves, water filters, and so forth, biogas systems. Then we have nature-based solutions. This covers projects like mangrove, forestry, RED+, so all that, anything that has to do with nature. Then renewable energy, so like wind, solar, hydro projects qualify for that. Waste management projects like landfills, methane capture, so they qualify. Sustainable building like stabilized bricks projects. Then we have efficiency innovation in industrial processes. So any project that is looking at improving efficiency in the industrial process, let's say in manufacturing or production, where you can prove that there is an efficiency gain, and transportation, where there is efficiency and fuel switching. So for example, if you have a project that is promoting a switch from diesel to maybe electric, like e-mobility projects, they actually qualify also for carbon financing. So for example, in the slides, you can see one of a project we have historically worked with in the country. They manufacture improved charcoal stoves and also firewood stoves, and they are expanding. They're in Kenya, they're in so many other countries in the sub-Saharan Africa. And the other one below is a metered LPG project, also based in Kenya, that have actually gone through successful registration and is already generating carbon credits. So I've mentioned about carbon standards. So what are carbon standards. These are internationally recognized bodies that are endorsed by the International Carbon Reduction Offset Alliance, what we call ICROA. And basically their role is, first they develop the methodologies and tools that are applied by projects in determining the eligibility, and also, of course, taking them through the registration and verification processes. And then they do the actual registration and issuance of projects, so that now they can generate the carbon credits that can be traded now. And then they also set the industry's best practice. So we are guided by a code of conduct, a lot of principles and requirements, rules that must be observed by all project developers and project representatives to make sure that you are developing something that is credible and that meets the set best practice in the industry. So there are we have a number of carbon standards currently in the market. So very popular ones is the VERA, so the verified carbon standard. It was previously known as VCS, but it's now known as VERA. And this is very popular for nature-based projects and also renewable energy projects. Then we have the gold standard. This is very popular for distributed technologies like cook stoves and water filtration. And we have others now, including the American Carbon Registry, Climate Action, the UNFCCC. This was previously being used under the compliance market, but since now we have moved into the Paris Agreement, so you cannot actually now register a project under the UNFCCC. So now this has moved to what we are calling the Article 6 of the Paris Agreement and the others. But the VERA gold standard, they command almost 80% of the registered and issued projects within the market. So what are the fundamentals of developing a carbon project? So the first one is the carbon projects must be real. So carbon credits are not a hoax. They must be real. And how we ensure this is real is you must prove that, the emissions actually exist. And this is achieved by, first, you have to maintain an actual database of your project. So if, for example, you are doing a cook stove project, you must provide the names or details of the end users who have benefited from that technology. And, we do monitoring on an annual basis. So meaning that at any one point we do random sampling, and you should be able to visit that household and show that this is the end user, this is the technology, and you can actually monitor and have interviews with the end users to confirm whether they have been using the units. And there are so many other metrics that we assess when we do the monitoring, and that forms the basis for doing the emission reduction calculations. Then this again now gets verified to prove that we have monitored and we can prove they actually exist. It must be measurable, so you must be able to measure, and we do this using approved tools and approved quantification calculations. So this, of course, you have to first assess the baseline. So the baseline is where you check the situation before you started implementing the project. And once you do that, now you set some baseline parameters. So for example, let me use my famous example of the cook stove project is you check if I'm selling an improved charcoal cook stove to somebody who in the baseline was using an unimproved charcoal stove, how much charcoal was being consumed in the baseline and how much is now being consumed in the project scenario. And from that, you can assess the efficiency improvement and the fuel savings that are associated with that process. So it must be something that you can measure and report. Then additionality. So when we talk of additionality is when we are doing the design of the project, you must be able to prove that without carbon finance, that project would not have existed. And this is one of the areas which actually makes most of the projects not to be eligible for carbon financing, because unless you can prove beyond, doubt that without this, it cannot happen, then you don't basically have a carbon project. It's good to note that under there is a set of countries, what we call the least developed countries, the LDCs, and these are under most of the projects under these countries are actually automatically additional. So because they are at very stages of being developed, so there are those that automatically fall under positive, what we call positive additionality. And there are also other project types that, depending on the nature of the project or the scale, they can be deemed automatically additional. Though good to note that with the ongoing scrutiny of carbon projects, I'll mention about it later, now we are moving at doing financial additionality, where you do a detailed analysis to prove actually that without carbon financing, this will not happen. And you actually have to account for how much of carbon finance is directly going into implementation of the project. Permanence, you have to ensure that there is no reversal risks. So when we talk of reversal, is you don't want to develop a project, then after some time, it is, it's no longer there, meaning that emission reductions that are already been generated by these projects have already been reversed. In a simple language, let's say you have implemented a forestry project, and then there is a fire outbreak that swipes all the forest. So, you don't have a project, and maybe you have already achieved carbon credits from it. So in such a cases, the standards have their own mechanisms, what we call the buffers and all that, where they just put a pool of carbon credits to mitigate any issues around reversals. Although ideally during the design, this must be integrated in the carbon design. Independently verified. So I mentioned that when you are designing and developing a carbon project, it must be verified by an independent and qualified third party. So the standards are actually train and certify auditors who are specifically tasked to monitor projects, to verify and validate projects. So this makes sure that the process is very independent and very transparent. So after verification, they either issue a positive or a negative report, and this is what actually goes to the standard for them to make an opinion based on what the third parties have provided. Unique, I mentioned that, one carbon credit is only associated with a single emission reduction. So you cannot double count. You cannot have, for example, distributed units across multiple programs. So one technology is only entitled for only one project. So for example, you cannot do a cook stove project in Uganda and then include the same projects in another country, let's say Tanzania. So this means that you must maintain a very distinct database of end users, and then it must be specified for the host boundary, or what we call the project boundary. So there is no multi-boundary transfer of technologies. And this database, again, must be verified by the third-party auditors to confirm that actually there is no double counting across projects. So what process is entailed to, what does it entail to develop a carbon project? So I'll take you through the gold standard process, because this is very popular and one of the standards we use almost on a day-to-day basis. So the process always starts, of course, once you have confirmed the design of the project and you have a technology, then that is the only time you can start the certification process. And it's good to mention that for you to develop this, because I know maybe it's one of, somebody may ask, if, for example, I have 2 trees in my household, they qualify for carbon financing. So let me use an example of technology. So you must prove you own the technology that you want to take through carbon certification. And if you are not the manufacturer or the owner of that technology, you must prove that you have an agreement with the producer or the manufacturer. In the case of nature-based projects, if you want to do a forestry project, you must have an agreement, if it's community, with the community in which you want to develop the project. If it's public land, then you must have an arrangement in writing with the government, because that is the only way you can prove the ownership of the carbon credits that will be developed from that project. Why this is very important is legally, let me use the term legally, the rightful owner of the carbon credits generated from, for example, distributed technology is the person who is actually using that technology. So if, for example, you buy an improved cook stove, you own those carbon credits because it's you who is using that carbon credit, using that technology. But then, because, carbon financing, as I've mentioned earlier, has gone into the manufacture, the development and implementation of the program, the project developers are required to obtain a consent from the end users to make sure that, they can confirm the end user have allowed them to claim the carbon credits from the use of that technology. So if, for example, you just buy a technology and keep it in your households without using it, you are not generating any carbon credits. But if you buy and use and we monitor and confirm that you are using this, then you are actually the rightful owner, and it has to be in writing or consent. Any form of consent is allowed to prove that the end users have allowed this. So once that is done, now that is when we start the certification process. It always starts with stakeholder consultation. So the project partners will organize a stakeholder consultation. They will invite a wide range of stakeholders, and actually the gold standard have guidance and requirements for how this process should be conducted, from how you plan for it, who you invite to the meeting, how the meeting is actually run, and the evidences and reports that need to be submitted as evidence that the stakeholder consultation was credibly conducted. So they'll look at issues around gender representativeness in those meetings. And, once that process is completed, that's when we do the very initial documents that we submit to the gold standard. And it's good to mention that from the time you decide you have started a project, so let's say from the time you start either planting trees or the time you start distributing the units, it's mandatory that you must submit the gold standard within 1 year. So that is the only way your project will be eligible. Otherwise, it will automatically not be eligible for carbon certification. So once the stakeholder process is complete, it goes through a process called preliminary review, where the standards look at compliance of the project with the stakeholder consultation requirements and their fees associated with each and every process. So like just taking through the project through the preliminary review, it costs around $2,000. And that process can take up to about 3 to 4 months. So from the time you hold the meeting to the time the preliminary review is completed. Successful completion of preliminary review results to the listing, what we call the listing of the project, meaning now you are given a go-ahead to continue with the registration of the project. So when you move now to the next stage is where you do a validation. So I mentioned earlier that you have to do a baseline to determine what is the baseline for your project. So you do a baseline survey, you review a lot of publicly peer-reviewed literature to confirm the baseline that you are setting for your project. And once you complete the validation, then this is the first stage at which you engage a third-party auditor who does a validation of your project against the baseline. So what happens at this stage is they will look at the baseline data you have collected and cross-check it against publicly available data to confirm that you are not overclaiming the baseline or overestimating the baseline. They will look at all the documentation and evidences that are there, and also confirm that the project is designed as per the approved methodologies that have been developed by the standards. So it's a very rigorous process that can take up to 7 months to complete. And once completed, now the validating body will issue a validation report that goes to the gold standard for what we call design review. So the cost for doing a design certification is 0.5 per credit. So at this stage, we do the ex-ante emission reduction calculation. So we estimate how much tons we anticipate the project will generate. And this forms the basis at which the standard will calculate the design review fee. So once that is done, a project goes through a successful design certification process, meaning that now you can be actually allowed to monitor the project and start claiming carbon credits from it. So from that, now you are allowed to do the monitoring. So the monitoring is normally done on an annual basis. What monitoring entails is at the validation stage, you develop a monitoring plan. And it's at this stage you confirm which parameters are going to be monitored. So the parameters are 3 levels. So there are those parameters that are outlined in the methodologies, depending on the methodology that you are applying. There are sustainable development goal parameters that you have also to commit at this stage and put them in the monitoring plan. And then we also have the safeguarding principles assessments that also are monitored at this stage. So I'll mention about those two in the next slide. So during monitoring, you train a team that will do the data collection. There are a lot of digital tools that have come into place that are used for data collection. And this basically entails, if, for example, it's distributed technologies, you have to visit the end users to confirm, they are using the units, and then there are the metrics that, you monitor for each and every project. So like the usage rate it must be monitored. If it's a cookstove project, you'll also check stacking. So what other project technologies are being used together with the device you have sold to the end user, and so many other metrics, and each of them goes to the GHG quantification process. So at this stage, you discount, for example, if people are using other non-project devices, you have to discount them from the calculations, because it basically shows that in as much as your technology is there, it's not used as it is required. The basis of this is because when, for example, you distribute these technologies, you are displacing something in the baseline. So for a cookstove project I mentioned, you could be displacing a 3-stone firewood. So ideally, if, for example, people continue using whatever they were using before your project, and they continue using now the project device, it shows that the baseline emissions are still there. And because you cannot verify how much of this is, the safe option is always to discount them. So once you complete the monitoring, you do the emission reduction calculations, and you do a monitoring report. So this monitoring report again goes to a third-party verification. So they will verify the monitoring report against the registered monitoring plan. So what you set out to monitor when you are doing the design is what they check, whether it has been implemented as required. A lot of support evidence at this stage is also required. So apart from just doing the emission reduction calculations, we request specific evidence for sustainable development goal outcomes. So if, for example, you are monitoring employment, we'll request to see the employment data with the number of male, female, the income levels, and all that. If, for example, we are monitoring health and safety, it's at this stage also where we check whether you have obtained all the required legal documents like relating to health and safety. And all this goes to the third party for verification. And an audit actually is also done at this stage. So they'll again visit the end users who are part of the monitoring you conducted, and they will go physically again to verify that actually the monitoring was done here, and whatever that is reported in the monitoring plan is what the end users reported. So after the verification, they will issue a verification report, either with a positive or negative opinion, and this will go to the gold standard for what we call performance review. So the performance certification process, again, depending on so many factors, can take between 7 to 9 months. And the fees associated for this, again, is $22.50 USD. So after successful performance certification, that is when the gold standard actually provides an issuance of the carbon credits. So this is now put in their registry, and once you visit the project, the standards registry, you can actually see the projects and all the issuances that have been made, and this is now open for trading. So people can access these projects and request to buy and sell their tons. So this is the process. And I think what you can see is that carbon development is not something that you can just wake up and decide, I want carbon credits by the end of the year. It has to be a well-thought process from the beginning. It's a very technical process that involves a lot of data collection, data management, and very accurate monitoring and reporting. And this will actually form one of the challenges that is faced by project developers, especially in the developing countries, because of the time and cost that are associated with this process. And also the third-party auditors, they are not available within the regions. So you have actually to contract them from mostly of them in Asia and Europe. So that's the biggest challenge actually that, we are facing in the industry. So how do
Lillian, sorry to interrupt. Just to note that we have 15 minutes left for the webinar.
I'm almost winding up,
Yep.
sorry. Yeah. So how do projects contribute to the UN SDGs? So we have the 17 SDGs that were set out in the by the United Nations. And so for the projects I've mentioned, you are required to demonstrate contribution to SDG 13 and any other two SDGs. And we also monitor the safeguarding principles. So you must commit to safeguard the socio-economic and environmental elements of the project. So to do the SDG monitoring reporting, there are internationally approved tools that you can use for this. And some of them include the VISTA, the Climate, Community and Biodiversity Standards, Gold Standard, SDG Impact Tool, and the ICAT. So these are tools you can easily access and see how they are employed to monitor the SDG impacts. So very briefly, so like this is a good explanation or an example of how we monitor SDG contributions for a cook stove project. So you have to identify the SDG goal that we want to contribute. I've mentioned SDG 13 is mandatory. So you choose any two others that you can come up with, map it against the SDG targets that are there for each SDG, and then you choose the indicator which must be monitorable. The SMART, use the SMART criteria, specific, measurable, accurate, and all that. So for example, let me use the gender equality one. You'll find that most of the projects will tend to monitor the time saved by women in fuel collection. So assuming they were collecting firewood in the baseline. For SDG 8, you have to prove that the project is providing equal pay for equal value of work done by both men and women. So you'll be required to monitor, if you choose that SDG, you'll be required to monitor the total number of jobs against that. So what are some of the challenges we are facing in the carbon asset development sector? So there's heightened security, there's a high call for transparency and quality improvement. So database must be credible and must be very transparent. The standards are changing, so new rules, new methodologies every day. So you have to keep a lot of monitoring on this and redesign the projects to meet these requirements. Country context, so we have emerging legislation in host governments. So this poses actually additional cost and processes and also risk for projects. So for example, if a carbon tax is introduced and it was not envisaged in the project design, it's something you have to factor in. So portfolio context, so the projects face very specific challenges, mostly around data availability and management, very low penetration rate for some technologies in some boundaries, and also the implementing capacity of some partners is very limited, and you have to do a lot of capacity building. And of course, external factors like monsoons, weather changing conditions in countries, it's also affecting. And very important, I've mentioned the VVB process. So it's a costly, and the availability of VVBs is not very easy to find. So what opportunities can we see in carbon asset? So operationalization of Article 6, so to allow for government-to-government trade to create more sustainability around projects. And this is actually the basis or our main push for the COP28 that is coming up. Then digital monitoring, reporting, and verification, DMRV, to support availability and development of high quality and credible data. We are seeing a lot of emerging technologies with very high potential of removals, so like direct carbon capture, setting up enabling legislation in host countries, basically to set a good framework and guidance for carbon trading, and setting up of regional validation and verification bodies for improved quality delivery, and also to lower cost to make it more viable for developing countries. So as we head to COP28, so the expectation, of course, is very enormous, because we are looking at the urgency in which we need to act. So it's no longer about just talking. It's time to act now. And COP28 is actually forming the main agenda for COP28 is, it's the first global stocktake, which will outline the status of government commitments to cut their emissions. So the governments have what we call the nationally determined contributions, NDCs, which basically they have set out, their own targets for cutting emissions below 1.5 degrees by 2030. So COP28 is moving towards, checking or doing a stock take of where governments are towards their NDCs. And this will also provide an opportunity for the private sector to do their own stock take again and identify where they can close emission gaps. And this is actually going to create more opportunity for carbon trading, because of the opportunities that will come through governments and collaborations to get meaningful solutions. So as a company, our goals for COP28, we are calling for full operationalization of Article 6, because this will allow countries to cooperate towards more ambitious climate targets through carbon trading. And implementation of Article 6 will basically support governments towards tackling coal, which is the biggest climate change goal, because over 80% of the emissions that are causing global warming are coming from coal from coal plants. And the aim here is to push for incentivization of developing countries so that they can retire the coal plants to replace them with clean energy. And then, of course, advance Africa as a destination for green growth and climate investment, because we know Africa has high potential in terms of resources and workforce, which remains untapped. And finally, to take action beyond AI and C. This will provide a blueprint for high emitting factors like the maritime and the aviation sectors to come up with also ambitious climate plans to offset their emissions. So this is under what we call the COSIA regime. So that brings me to the end of my presentation. Thank you for listening, and I'm happy to take in any questions. Thank you.
Hi, Lilian, can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, good. Sorry, I had to change my position because my battery was low. Thank you so much for the presentation. I can see there are a few questions coming in the chat box. So I will go through the questions, giving you a few seconds to just relax after your presentation. Okay, so if you are ready, can we begin with the Q&A session?
Yes, please.
All right. Okay. So the first question is, could you please provide a practical example that demonstrates that carbon finance is integral to the viability of the project?
Okay. Yeah. So happy to take that one. Yeah. So I've mentioned that carbon finance is going directly to supporting project development. So let me use an example of a forestry project because it's one of the most demanded projects across the globe. So for example, if a project developer wants to do a forestry project, of course, let me use the example of a community. So they will approach the community, confirm, the ownership or the land tenure system of that land where they intend to do the forestry project. And then they will come up with an agreement of, what trees are going to be planted, when are they going to be planted, and what will be the share of revenue from the carbon credits generated. So in such a case, it's when, depending on, there's a price against each carbon credit, and project developers are required to be very transparent on this. So what happens is the project developer, like what we do is we provide pre-financing for such projects because of what I mentioned, the time and cost that goes into this. So once we provide the pre-financing, we'll give this to the project partner, and he will mobilize the community. They will schedule the planting seasons for the trees. They will monitor the trees up to the time they mature and start generating carbon credits. And then in return, so this can be, depending on the type of trees, it can be 5 to 10 years. Once now the carbon credit starts coming in, most projects provide up to 20-30% that goes directly into the community. And this is shared among like the farmers, or for example, if it's an agroforestry project, whatever products that are sold from that project, again, the revenue that is generated from that is shared with the community. So in simple language is they must account for the carbon financing that is going into the project and come up with a way in which it is going to be shared with communities.
Hi, hi everyone. Can you hear me properly?
Yes.
Perfect. So I'll just read another question from the chat box. Climate credit has been argued by critics to be counterproductive. It has been linked to the sale of indulgence during the papacy, Catholic hegemony. How true is this?
So on that, I think I've mentioned there is heightened scrutiny in the market, and some of them are credible issues. There's also a lot of greenwashing that is associated with some carbon projects. but not all carbon projects are actually bad, because it depends with how a project is designed. But as we stand, or where we stand, is I've mentioned that these projects have to be verified by third-party auditors and also the standards. So in case there is any evidence of malpractice around projects, they can actually be deregistered, or they can actually even be asked to pay back any carbon credits that have been issued to them. We've seen this happen, especially I think this year has been the height of it all. So it's true, it is there. And actually, from the stakeholder engagement process, any form of malpractice or overcrediting claims are open to the standards, and you can actually report these issues directly to the standards, and action is actually taken to these projects.
Amazing. Thank you so much. I would now like to take a question which we have received in advance from the registration form. The question is, how can African banks and financial institutions tap into the vibrant carbon finance market in the global north?
Great. So overall, let me speak that Africa, we are still at very early stages of, carbon asset development process. And actually, just like 2 months back, Kenya, we were privileged to host the very first ever African Climate Summit that saw so many heads of state come into the country with one goal: to discuss climate change. And there are a lot of discussions around that on carbon trading. And the beauty of that is they came up with a declaration, or what we call the Nairobi Declaration on Climate Action. So it's very critical, because without enabling legislations first, it does not, there's a challenge for even the private sector, the banks and so forth, financial institutions to come into the industry and play. But they have actually a very big role to play, because some of these projects, especially in developing countries, without capital, without pre-financing, it's almost impossible to implement them. So banks and any other financial institutions with the right legislation and policy framework, they can actually come in very handy to support, carbon asset development financing, specifically financing for projects. But good to note that, part of why this process is not very widely explored by financial institutions, it's that it's a very high risk process, because, you may put a lot of millions into a project, and then it does not end up, delivering the carbon credits because of maybe poor implementation and all that. That's why it's very good to work with a person who understands, or an organization that understands the design and also the development process, like what we do as climate impact partners, because we'll provide the pre-financing, but we'll also do a lot of quality control in the development process and the technical management of the project, to make sure that at the end of it all, any risks are identified and mitigated, and the project is designed to deliver carbon credits. But the challenge we've been seeing is actually that, there are projects that get financing, but actually not end up delivering, and that's a very high risk for the financiers. Yeah.
Amazing. Lilian, just to note that we are almost towards the end of the webinar. We will overrun just by a few more minutes. And for attendees who would like to continue staying for the Q&A session, please do so. I will take more around 2 or 3 more questions. All right. So the next question is, you did mention quite briefly about the carbon asset development and the world standard. Is this the same in all the countries across the globe?
Yes. So the gold standard is an international body. So there is a standardized process for taking projects through registration and issuance, regardless of the project boundary, regardless of the country. Basically, the process is the same, and it basically follows the steps I have outlined. But the process may vary slightly with other standards, although the generic or the standard process always is stakeholder consultation, validation, registration, monitoring, and verification. So it's almost very standard. Yeah.
Thank you so much for that response. All right, so the next question is, what kind of engagement are you doing to make a wider social, economic, cultural, political, and environment impact of carbon hygiene?
Carbon hygiene.
Yes.
Oh, that's a new term I'm learning also. But yeah, what I can say is when we do the design, it covers all areas. So it covers the social, the economic, and the environment, because I've mentioned the SDG goals. So we monitor that, and the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, basically covers, it's a wide range of socio-economic and environmental. But then there is also a very detailed safeguarding principles assessment. Actually, it's like a 5-page assessment that you have to do, where you check against very defined metrics for projects on social, like introducing child labor, is there fair equal pay for equal value of work done. You look at environment. Are you introducing invasive species or GMOs, or are you causing any harm? Basically it's a commitment to do no harm to the environment, social, and economic aspects for project. And anywhere, even if it's not a known risk, but there's potential that this will happen, you actually have to put it in the monitoring plan and monitor on every year basis. And for some risks, actually you have to get opinion of experts in those areas. So for example, if it's a gender related issues, you may actually be required to contract a gender person to provide their opinion every year on how the project is safeguarding against those issues.
That's a really valid point. Thank you so much. The next question is, how are carbon credits of trees calculated, and how many trees does one need to have considered registering for carbon crediting?
Wow. So unfortunately, that's a very technical question, and it may require maybe a whole day sitting to take you through the calculations. But it goes from way before how you determine the baseline. And then now, for trees, it's not just planting. You have to monitor what we call the tree growth rate. And this is very it depends with the tree type and all that. The number of credits will determine on how big your land is. And it's good to note that, the projects must be scalable, because you may think that, one tree, having 1,000 trees is a lot. But when you do the calculations, it could just end up giving you about 5,000 tons. So it's about scale, it's about scalability, and it's also about monitoring. So for the calculations, unfortunately, I cannot go through the specific details, but a tree in a year can give you around up to 2-3 tons, depending on, its age and so many other factors, climatic conditions and all that. But the quantification process is very scientific. Yeah.
All right. I mean, you did your best to respond to the question. If our attendees would like to get in touch with you to know more about this, they please do feel free to get in touch via LinkedIn or email, which we will share very shortly. Just one last question. I know there are quite a few questions in the chat box, but I think I will now wrap up the webinar with one final question. Does carbon financing apply to the oil and gas industry?
I think if you are doing a development, let me get this. If, for example, let me say, the standards have their own limitations. On the very first slide I took you on project eligibility, they have some cautions on, even some fuels like fossil fuels. You cannot do a coal project and all that. So there are restrictions specifically on oil and gas, unless you are doing it as a fuel switch, so switching from those high polluting fuels to a more cleaner fuels. But yeah, there are limitations around that.
Okay, all right. one final. I know I said the last one was the final question. So last question is, you mentioned about the connection with children's involvement. Could you explain more about that?
Children, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So what I've mentioned is when you develop projects, there's that respect to the safeguarding principles that are set out. And some of specific issues relating to these projects are issues around child labor and yeah, anything that, may negatively impact on the overall quality of children. So in case, for example, you mentioned that, a project is involving use of children, actually it would automatically be ineligible. And then also there are, other SDG contributions that are very specific for children, like quality of education. So for example, if you are doing a solar lighting project that, you are switching from use of kerosene lanterns to use of solar products, you are directly contributing towards the welfare of children through, a better reading environment. And, those are some of the things that we look into when we look at the design of the projects.
Thank you so much for explaining that, Lilian. I think with this, we will end the Q&A session for today. I really hope I could take more questions. There were some really great questions in the chat box and that we received in via the registration form in advance. However, if we can go to the next slide, please. If you would like to discuss more on this topic, or if you'd like to ask any further questions to Lilian, please feel free to get in touch with her via her email address, which you can see on your screen. And you can also connect with Lilian on LinkedIn. Please feel free to ask any further questions or to connect with her to know more about her work or to know more about carbon finance projects and how it's relevant with upcoming COP28 or how it's relevant to your work or study area. With this, thank you so much, Lilian, for the wonderful presentation. I hope you've enjoyed presenting your work. And if you have any final words before we end the webinar.
I think for me, it's just to thank you everyone and specifically CSC for reaching out. And I'm happy to be part of this webinar. I hope the participants have learned something. And as you've mentioned, I'm very happy to take in a lot of more additional questions and provide and also network as we move forward. So thank you for your time and hope to network again soon.